behavior came from Jeff himself at the conclusion of his trial, where he said, "Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did, not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick, or evil, or both. Now I believe I was sick. I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. My attempt to help identify the remains was the best that I could do, and that was hardly anything. I feel so badly for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know society will never be able to forgive me. I know the families of the victims will never be able to forgive me for what I have done. I am so very sorry, Your Honor. I know that you are about to sentence me, and I ask for no consideration." And Jeffrey Dahmer got his request. He was sentenced to 15 life sentences, but even in prison, the urges didn't stop. Jeffrey would say during interviews, "It never completely goes away. I'll probably have to live with it for the rest of my life. I wish it would go away. I wish there was some way to completely get rid of the compulsive thoughts, the feelings. It's not nearly so bad now that there is no avenue to act on it, but it never seems to go completely away." What made him do it? Was it just urges? To his credit, he did resist the urges for a number of years. But what he needed was something beyond self-control. His efforts to control himself ultimately failed. He needed something beyond himself, something more powerful than himself. No one fully understands what drove Jeffrey Dahmer to commit his heinous crimes. Everybody on the psychiatric teams on both prosecution and defense admitted that they did not have all the answers about Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeff himself was curious about why he did the things that he did. Ultimately, no one will ever know. Try to imagine yourself in Jeff's shoes at the end of his trial. You have done some of the most horrible things recorded in civilized society. You are universally hated and despised by every member of your species. You want to die, but the state has refused to put you to death. Where do you go? Where do you turn? Is there a force or a power greater than yourself? As the old saying goes, when you're flat on your back, there's only one direction you can possibly look to, and that is up. Jeff would have to turn to God. First day that I met Jeff, I had received a phone call. Well, I'll probably get into this more tomorrow. I received a phone call that he wanted to be baptized. And I had never been to a prison before, so it was an experience for me to find out how prisons work and how what hoops you jump through and so forth. And I've had to learn that over the years and so forth. But I finally got to visit with him the very first time that I met him. And I had two basic questions to ask him. One is, why do you want to be baptized? I was curious. What did he know about baptism that he would want in the first place? And the second was, what is your religious background, if you have any? And I was shocked to find out that his religious background was the Church of Christ. The a cappella Churches of Christ. That's the church his family went to when he was a small boy. And he told me on that first meeting, I remember going to church as a small boy and falling asleep in the pew. Something many of you probably have experienced when you were small children too. And he said that for some reason, and I don't know why, they quit going to church when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I have no idea why. And Jeff never found out why. After his death, when I finally met Lionel Dahmer, I presented to him the fact that Jeff always wondered why he quit going to church. And then I got a little bit of the story from the father's side. And I'll get more into that then. But it was horrible that the young man didn't know. And I remember when I first heard that thinking, wow, he's one of our boys. He's one of our children. Over the years, as a minister and as an elder, I have bled spiritually when people quit the church. And I think some of you don't understand what I'm talking about. You're trying to get as many people as you can to come to church, and you know that by coming to church, it's not just coming to church alone, but by getting involved in church, their lives are going to develop, and they're going to grow, and they're going to blossom, and things will get better for them. But some of them just don't try. and they just quit, and they give up. And here was one whose family had given up. And now, look where the young man was. By the time I come on the scene, he had already been tried, he'd already been found out. He was wanting to know if he could be baptized. That's where I came into the picture. And I'll have more to say about that. But I remember shaking my head and wondering, my. Imagine how much his life would have been different had his folks just not given up. Well, there's a whole story there as well, too. But Jeff finally came to faith, and I think I'll leave that for tomorrow anyway, as to what's going on there. But I'm talking tonight about the dark journey of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's a horrible story. And it's horrible not just for you to hear what he did, but if you can put yourself into his shoes and try to understand how he felt about himself. He was scandalized by his own crimes. On one occasion, when I was visiting him at Columbia Correctional Institution, he said to me, and I often bring this point up when people question his sincerity. For some reason, that's the most common question I get from members of the church. Did I think Jeffrey Dahmer was really sincere about wanting to be baptized? And obviously I did, because I baptized him. I mean, to some degree, it's like they're questioning, are you really saying to have done this? What, did he fool you? I mean, were you doing this for some other reason? Why did you? They're hoping I would say, no, he wasn't sincere. But I used to tell this story. On one occasion, Jeff confided to me, and normally, by the way, we didn't talk about his crimes. I wasn't there to talk about his crimes. I was there to build up his faith. But on one occasion, he said to me, I feel I should have been put to death by the state for my crimes. That was his confession to me. To which I responded, I agree with you. Your crimes deserve death. I'm not trying to get into the great debate that Wisconsin has about capital punishment. I'm just speaking as a Christian. He committed crimes that were worthy of death. The Bible speaks of crimes that are worthy of death. And he deserved that as far as I'm concerned. So then his question back to me was, if that's the case, and by this time he'd been baptized, and he was a Christian, trying to grow as a Christian, the question back to me was, am I sinning against God now by living? Just let that one sit on you for a minute there. It's kind of a deep question, kind of profound. And of course, he'd waved to the guard and said, you got 2 minutes and your time is up to ask this question. So it's not the kind of question I could give a short answer in 2 minutes. All I can say is, well, next week we're going to study a passage of the Bible. I assigned him to read Romans chapter 13, the first 7 or 10 verses. I'm not sure exactly how far that is offhand. And we'll study that. So the next week we came back and we studied that. And it talked quite a bit about how the Christian must submit to the governing authorities. And the governing authority is the agent of God, the agent of wrath. That's what the governing authority is. And the authority bears a sword. It doesn't say a rod, it says a sword. And a sword suggests life or death. The state has the power to take your life if you do something worthy of losing your life. The state can do it. So you're exhorted in that passage, obey for the sake of not losing your life. And so I made the point, as a Christian, your obligation is to submit to this governing authority. Now, in this particular case, this state decided to lay its sword down and pick up a rod instead. So they're going to just whip you for 987 years until they're done whipping you, and then they're done. Well, of course, you're going to die before that time. But what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is not to harangue the state or disagree with the state or argue with the state. Your responsibility is to submit. So you need to live as best as you can for Christ. But because the question implied the question of suicide, then we start talking about suicide. And I was able to identify with that because there was a time in my life when I had become so depressed that I had also thought about suicide. And I thought about it a lot. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I openly confess it. As I said before, I believe there's power in confession. And so I was able to confess to Jeff that I understood how that felt. And I began to describe how I felt. And he identified exactly with what my feeling was. When you feel like committing suicide, all you're thinking about is escaping the pain. And the only way you can think of to escape the pain is death. You're willing to throw yourself on the mercy of God even in your foolishness, because that's usually what you're in a state of when you want to commit suicide, you're in a state of foolishness, you're willing to throw yourself on the mercy of God just to get rid of the pain. That's all you're thinking about. And you're not really thinking about how I serve God in the present time, how my service to God in this present time influences other people. So he spent quite a bit of time talking about a Christian's responsibility to live for God and how you shine as a light in a dark place. And that this is what God is counting on you to do. And by the end of our discussion, he had concluded he wasn't going to commit suicide. This wasn't what he was intending to do. But I often tell the story to illustrate how sincere he was. He was so sincere about his sins, he felt he should have been put to death. And he felt if the state wouldn't do it, maybe he should do something about putting himself to death. And in a prison setting like where he was, it wouldn't have been hard to imagine how one would go about doing that. There is bribery there. There are people you can ask to do things for you. There are people you can simply irritate enough, and they will do that for you without even being paid. Jeff walked a very, very dark journey. And why did he go there? It's hard to give an answer. The best answer I've ever found comes from the book of Romans, chapter 1. And I'm going to read a very familiar passage to you, I think. I hope it's familiar for you anyway. As Paul begins to describe the revelation of the gospel. Many of you are familiar with verse 1 and verse 16 and 17. 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. One of the marvelous things when we start talking about grace is this righteousness that is revealed in the gospel. A righteousness that is not earned, that is not deserved, that is simply not right. A righteousness that is frankly wrong, where God calls you right when you know and everyone else knows you're not right. There's something wrong with you, but God still says you're right. That's revealed in the gospel. But more than that, I pick up at verse 18 now. But the wrath of God is being revealed. Not only is the righteousness revealed, but a wrath of God is revealed too, from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. That's a pretty deep thought. You might want to park it there sometimes. Just think about that. When you meet your Maker, you're going to probably have a lot of excuses for why you couldn't live the Christian life or why you failed to live the Christian life. And there is no excuse. God knows you better than you know yourself. There is no excuse. You can try to come up with excuses. You can try to come up with all kinds of explanations. Can you imagine Jeff saying, I had these urges. I couldn't overcome these urges. You put the urges in me, God. You made me this way. Why did you make me this way, God? There is no excuse. For although, he continues, they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over to sinful desires of the heart, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men who also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to the depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They had become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. There is no more eloquent description of the dark journey of Jeffrey Dahmer than that. Well, it looks like we've run out of time. I usually act, open the door to if you have any questions you can ask. I'll do the best I can to answer them. Sometimes the correct answer is, I don't know. Yes?
Where did he get his income? How did he keep going, paying the rent and providing himself with food? And where it come from?
I know that he worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory for a time, so he had some income from that. Other than that, I don't know. I know that some people who live on the street can live on the street for a long time on what it looks like to me is nothing. But you learn to become street wise, and you get by, and you make money in various ways. So I don't know is the correct answer, other than I know he worked at a chocolate factory. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were asking a question. Yes, here. You, yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
when you first got the phone call, how did you feel?
Yeah, I'll talk probably more about that tomorrow, but yes, when I first got a phone call from Rob McRae, who was a preacher at Northtown Church in Milwaukee, saying that he had gotten a phone call from someone down in Oklahoma that Jeffrey Dahmer wanted to be baptized. And of course, the first thing I'm thinking of is, how would the guy in Oklahoma know about Jeffrey Dahmer in Wisconsin? And what does Jeffrey Dahmer know about baptism? And Rob he's just leaving to go to a convention in Chicago, so he says, I just don't have the time to deal with this. But Roy lives closer, let's ask Roy. That's what he did. And so at first I was full of all kinds of questions. I just didn't know. And the first question was, is it true? That was the first question. And if it is true, how could it be true? Because there was so much that I just didn't know at all. But I'll get more into that tomorrow as I get into the experience that I had. This story is not just a story of Jeffrey Dahmer. As I've alluded to in my earlier statement, it's also the story of RoyR. But more than that, it's a story of God. How God works in the lives of people. Because it was God that ultimately brought RoyR to Jeffrey Dahmer, and brought Jeffrey Dahmer to the point of saying, would someone please baptize me? I don't care who. Someone please out there will baptize me. And so it's all God's work is what it comes down to. And so actually there's three stories woven together here. And yet my story, although it's unique and interesting in itself, is not terribly unique. For all of you share similar stories where you have been influenced by the power of God in your lives. And God has brought you to a certain stage in your life where sometimes you come to the fork in the road and you must make a decision. And sometimes you made the right decision and sometimes you made the wrong decision. And sometimes you had to learn to repent, which means retracing your steps and going the right way. So you all know a little bit of the story yourself. But that's part of what we're talking about today. We're talking about this particular story. And to some degree, you can all identify because you all share the same faith. Yes?
Have you encountered people who are angry at you